Tag this is a serious review. You have to take it seriously. I know it's been a while since I did a video, and here I am being like, I'm doing a serious review. Yeah, I meant to film this ages ago. Today we're talking about Babel. Babel. Okay, look. I've always understood it to be tomato kind of thing, Babel versus Babel. But then I've just been hardcore corrected by my friends in the UK, and so I'm like, I will do my best to call it Babel because I guess that is the correct pronunciation. And sorry if I call it Babel. We're talking about Babel, the latest release from RF Kuang. Babel left me all the things. I realized very quickly the emotions I was feeling when I finished Babel were very similar to when I first ever saw Hayao Miyazaki's film, The Wind Rises. If you're not particularly familiar with this film, it's an animated and admittedly pretty highly fictionalized biopic about Jiro Horikoshi, the chief engineer of numerous Imperial Japanese fighter plane designs, including the infamous Mitsubishi A6M Zero, which would earn its fearsome reputation in the US during the attack on Pearl Harbor in 1941. I suppose what I mean in this comparison is something like cognitive dissonance. In the case of the film, the sympathy I felt for the character of Horikoshi-san couldn't help but be tempered by the knowledge of what it was his creations were going to do. Now, while the film is ultimately a tale of a creative losing control over the use for his own creations, again, I said it was pretty highly fictionalized, and while it is true the engineer himself was opposed to Japan entering World War II, one has to remember what the consequences of this man's creations were: furtherance of attempted imperial expansion through violence. Now, reading Babel, my dissonance, and I guess at times even something close to discomfort, came from the knowledge not that the sympathetic protagonist would eventually inflict violence upon the country in which I was born, though I would hardly call myself any kind of nationalist, and also, in the case of this book, I'm not at all British. Gee, we're shocked. But instead, it was that my own cultural history and heritage contributed to the horror that was wreaked upon Kuang's protagonist and his homeland and his other BIPOC friends in the story. I couldn't help but think of this moment when in my final year of university, I ended up studying abroad in London. There was a program to study there as a part of my degree in which I was able to participate. I recall being in one of these classes where the professor in charge actually asked, "What are you?" To which I responded, "I'm Greek, French, Belgian, Italian, and Irish." Now, granted, this was before I knew there was actually some secret, like, Ashkenazi Jew in that Belgian, but that's a story for a different day. That's, oh boy. Anyway, this answer I gave him actually took the professor by surprise because he said he assumed I would give the answer American. What does that even mean? I think, frankly, that's too big a question for me to be posing in any kind of book review or discussion. But I can say that I am, at least in some areas of that cultural heritage that I listed out, really close in line to the very people who emigrated from those countries of origin to the United States. And I think, in a way, that's perhaps why I feel the way that I do. Heritage, in a strange way, holds an odd significance in my life as it pertains to kind of my sense of self and the sense of the family tree I am a part of. But that does mean I have to sit here and say, so what happens when that heritage, say the French heritage, had a history of imperial expansion and colonization, of invading and decimating other so-called savage or lesser cultures, and doing their utmost to obliterate them, for lack of a better word, in the name of civilizing them. How do I feel when an author brilliantly lays imperialism, colonialism, and some of the most insidious aspects of inherent, ingrained, and institutionalized racism to bear across hundreds of pages of incomparable prose and visceral storytelling power? Angry, enraged, ashamed, horrified, shattered, really. I also freely acknowledge and kind of had to come to terms with the idea that what I feel is kind of ultimately unimportant. As a white person of predominantly Western European heritage, I am more than aware of the fact that this book has the power to mean so much more to those who have actually suffered such indignities. I could speak to sexism inside and outside, academics, but like that kind of racism, no. It's like, but the thought that a nation actively worked to erase my heritage and culture and then wanted me to feel grateful for it, or then later tell me what's the big deal, it makes me feel sick. It's supposed to make me feel sick. I think I'd be more concerned if I didn't feel sick by it. And I will also certainly be concerned by anyone who doesn't feel this novel's like gut punch of an impact in that regard. Babel is a scathing condemnation of imperialism and all the institutionalized racism that has colored the world of academia as a result, both then and even now. The fact that, in Kuang's own words, the racism she experienced at Oxford inspired this novel kind of makes the emotions feel even more raw. The observances are all the more cutting. I mean, Kuang is pulling no punches in this story, and frankly, nor should she. And that's not to say that her writing in any way lacks subtlety when I say she's not pulling punches. Far from it. I'd even lean towards labeling the writing style of Babel as a kind of pastiche of narrative nonfiction. I mean, footnotes and all. While I initially read this book as a digital arc on my iPad, it did still include the footnotes, and the footnotes actually worked. So I want to say good job to whoever was in charge of formatting the arc to make sure those footnotes work. I've read some digital arcs with footnotes where the footnotes don't really work when you have to click on them and go back and forth. These ones did. A+. And so when I finally did get to see the footnotes as they are in the physical copy, yes, this is the UK hardback because I just couldn't resist, they work out really well. The color and depth in the writing of Babel honestly bears all the hallmarks of masterwork fiction, to the point that I was sitting here like, dude, is Babel like her magnum opus? I mean, it's probably a little too early in her writing career to be saying that, but honestly, asking the question, the fact that I sat and asked it, I think is a pretty good indication of how good I thought Babel was. Babel, not Babel. Oh, I did it again. Babel is a novel that challenges you. It dares you to look beyond the glitter and glam of the empire and all the supposed good that it has done. It dares you to look at the way so-called learned men legitimize the great machine and its atrocities, either actively or passively, within the hallowed halls of world-class academic institutions, like, say, Oxford University. Especially when you then stop to think about how and why such places were able to acquire and collect such vast amounts of information and resources. How they added all of those pieces to their enviable collections. Beyond that, I would say Babel is also just a love song to language and linguistics. All languages and all their splintering like spider web of dialects, especially when our main character Robin is coming from Canton. And if you want to talk about a language that has a whole host of dialects, Chinese is one of them, and that is one of the many reasons I also say I think Chinese is a wildly complex and complicated language for an idiot like me who doesn't know tonal languages to try and learn, because beyond the whole it's a tonal language aspect, there are so many dialects. And language is power unmatched, both in Babel as a novel and kind of in the real world. And thus I think everybody should respect the power of language. Babel makes sure you have to respect the power of language and of lexicon, of word choice. And also to think that thus when language grows corrupted by men who seek to co-opt it and fashion themselves as new gods upon earth, well, let's just say at that point, Babel must fall. Not will, or can, or should. Must. Babel must fall.